Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to our fourth webinar in the Irish Bioenergy Association webinar series 2020. My name is Sean Finan and I am the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association. This morning's topic is sustainable bioenergy, achieving carbon neutrality and compliance with RED II. Before we begin our presentations this morning, I'd just like to briefly introduce you to the Irish Bioenergy Association for any of you joining us this morning who are non-members of the association. We are the representative organisation for the bioenergy sector on the island of Ireland, the sectors of biomass, biogas, biofuels, energy crops and wood fuels. We have a broad and growing membership and we work on behalf of our members through representation, lobbying, advocacy, networking. We provide technical support to our members, advice and information. We engage in a number of research and demonstration projects, including our European Innovation Partnership Small Biogas Demonstration Project, our InterReg 3C project, which is looking at carbon products and biochar, our Biomass Installers and Designers Register, and the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme. This morning's webinar, as I said, is webinar number 4, and after my opening, I will hand over to Jean-Marc Jossart, who is the Secretary General of Bioenergy Europe. That will be followed in by a presentation by Noel Gavigan, who is the Technical and Projects Executive with the Irish Bioenergy Association. We will then follow that with a panel discussion with Q&A with the presenters, and for you attendees, you can submit your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we will endeavour to answer as many of your questions as possible. So our first speaker this morning is Jean-Marc Jossart, Secretary General at Bioenergy Europe. IrBEA is a proud member of Bioenergy Europe. Jean-Marc started his career in the field of bioenergy in 1992 at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Jean-Marc is an agro-engineer, and since 1997 he held the position of Secretary General of Bioenergy Europe. Founded in 1990, Bioenergy Europe is a non-profit, Brussels-based international organisation bringing together more than 40 associations and 90 companies, as well as academic and research institutes from across Europe representing the interests of the sector. And this morning, Jean-Marc will give us an insight into the perspective from European level on the whole area of carbon neutrality and the RED II directive. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jean-Marc. So Jean-Marc, if you want to share your presentation.
So thanks. Do you see my PowerPoint now?
Yes, we do. Yes. Thanks, Jean-Marc.
So thanks for your kind introduction. I will indeed discuss now sustainable bioenergy, especially in the light of the achievement of the carbon neutrality in Europe and the compliance with the Renewable Energy Directive, the second version. First, as Sean mentioned, we'll try to go to the next slide, if it works. It doesn't seem to work. First, just a quick introduction to our association. Bioenergy Europe, as Sean said, is the main European association representing the interest of the bioenergy sector. Really a key importance these days, especially because you might know that Europe has increasing competence, especially in the energy sector, the climate sector. So we go beyond agriculture, which is the traditional competence of the EU. We have roughly 140 members, among which the Irish Bioenergy Association, together with 39 other associations, but also companies. And we always welcome new members, so it would be a good idea for you to join Bioenergy Europe in the coming days. Coming to the topic, the Commission proposed very recently really ambitious objectives. One of the most ambitious objectives, if not the most ambitious objectives in the last 20 years, meaning to reach carbon neutrality in 2050. Carbon neutrality means that our emissions should be compensated by the capture of CO2 from the atmosphere. In fact, we capture CO2 with the forest and possibly in the future with our carbon sequestration and storage. But it means that this is really a new paradigm for Europe, that is this unprecedented objective that we need to reach. And for this, we only have roughly one generation. And as you can see on this graph, that we have for the moment still roughly 80% of non-renewable energy. So you can really realize now how big is that challenge, because reducing our emissions close to zero means that we need to go for close to 100% renewable energy, while we are now close to 20%. Bioenergy representing the lion's share of it, as we have roughly 60% of renewables made of bioenergy. Then comes hydropower, wind, PV, and the others. So you see with this slide clearly that bioenergy is really a key sector to reach the carbon neutrality of Europe. There are several advantages of bioenergy. One of them is the indigenous character of bioenergy. In fact, many people do not know that, but we are producing in Europe more bioenergy than natural gas. We are producing more bioenergy than coal in Europe. And at the same time, we import roughly, as you can see on this graph, roughly 5% of our consumption. So which is way below the 74% for gas or the 93% imports for oil. So really, in terms of energy dependence of Europe, bioenergy will also play a key role. Another aspect of bioenergy is that it covers various sectors, the heat sector, electricity sector, and the transport sector. We are, however, closer to the market for the heat sector in terms of economic profitability, and that's why roughly 3/4 of bioenergy is made of heat. So bioenergy is heating buildings. Bioenergy is providing steam to the industries. Bioenergy is supplying the district heatings to heat small and large cities in Europe. So really, we can play a role and decarbonize many sectors. We are also a sector that provides many jobs opportunities. As you can see on this slide as well, bioenergy represents more jobs than all of the renewables together. And this is explained by the fact that that compared to other renewables, we need to gather some feedstock. We have to produce biomass in a very decentralized way. In forest, in agriculture, we have to transport this biomass. We have to convert this biomass into a useful fuel, like pellets or wood chips, for example. And that's why we generate a lot of jobs. And we understand, we know that how crucial it is in the future for the social cohesion of Europe to create many jobs, especially in the rural areas where the biomass is located. This has a consequence on the economy as well. We have a turnover of 60 billion euro. But what is especially interesting as well is the growth rate. We have a kind of a growth rate of several percent per year in the last 20 years that many other sectors would envy. And last but not least, if for investments in bioenergy plants in Europe, there is a great chance that that these investments will be supplied with equipment coming from European-based companies. We have a database of biomass suppliers, equipment suppliers, and we have evaluated that 74% of them are based in Europe. Many other renewable technologies cannot tell the same story. Many equipment now, as you know, are produced in China. This is not the case for the bioenergy sector. The European industry in Europe is really the leader in the know-how and the technologies for bioenergy. So we need to keep this know-how by investing in bioenergy further in Europe. Second point for this presentation is the Renewable Energy Directive. The number two covers the coming decade up to 2030. The idea is to establish a common framework for the promotion of renewable energy sources with binding target. This is one of the key characteristics of the directive, is to set a target for renewables, 32% by 2030, but also regulate somehow the financial support to renewables, and also establish sustainability criteria for all kinds of bioenergy, biofuels, bioelectricity, and bioheat, at least for the large scale. When I mentioned targets, in fact, the targets applies at the European level, but of course, this is a contribution by all member states. And these member states had to submit national energy and climate plans very recently, and they were assessed by the Commission. And you see on this graph, which is a bit complicated, sorry for that, but the share of renewable energy for electricity, heat, and transport in 2030. But we will concentrate now on the share of renewable energy which are the horizontal blue and red lines. And we see that 5 countries have increased significantly their share of renewables between 2018 and 2030. These are Denmark, Greece, Spain, Lithuania, and the Netherlands. So they are very ambitious to help the EU to reach their target. Other countries, and this is typical for any kind of sector, some other countries are much less ambitious. Let's mention Bulgaria, Malta, Romania, Slovenia. Should be noted on this slide that we are still missing the island. So we are hoping that in Bioenergy Europe, that Ireland will also come with extremely ambitious objectives for renewables. If we analyze a bit further these data from the action plans, we see that on average, the member states are counting very much on bioenergy among other renewables to reach their target. And for bioelectricity, they are planning a growth of 30% in the coming decade, which is in line with the recent trends that we had for bioelectricity. And this is a kind of good news for the companies and for the market in the future in Europe. And the same is valid for bioheat. where we see the similar trend with plus 26% in the coming decade. And if you see on this graph, we have really doubled the amount of bioheat or we will double that in 30 years, which is a nice achievement, knowing also the level. It's easy to grow a sector, it's easy in bracket, but it's easy to grow a sector that is really starting to emerge in Europe. But in the case of bioheat, this is the main, by far, the main renewable energy source, and it continues growing at a constant pace, which is really, again, a good sign for the market. Finally, the sustainability criteria have been negotiated in the Renewable Energy Directive. In other words, it means that to count for the targets that I've just mentioned in the member states, the biomass has to be sustainable and by law, which is really extraordinary. Yeah? It's not, no other renewables have to reach that kind of as such mandatory requirements, and without speaking of fossil fuels, of course, that have absolutely nothing. Concentrating now on the forest biomass, what does it mean? It means that the harvesting operations of the forest needs to be legal, that the forest regeneration takes place, that the areas designated for nature protection should be protected, that the impact on soil quality and biodiversity should be minimized, and the harvesting does not exceed the long-term production capacity of the forest. This sounds like very broad criteria, and but their implementation is quite challenging. We are now in Bioenergy Europe intensively working on the implementation of these criteria, because all these criteria needs to be implemented next year in 2021. It means that all the methodologies behind are discussed for the moment with the Commission, and I can tell you that the devil sometimes can be in the details. There is another set of criteria that we called the LULUCF criteria, the land use change, and forestry requirements. That says that if the country signed the Paris Agreement and has submitted its national determined contribution, then it's okay for this criteria. But you should know that the criteria applies for any kind of biomass used in Europe, even if the biomass is imported. As we've seen before, we don't import much biomass, but still in the case of imports, and in the case the country has not signed the Paris Agreement, then that country needs a national law to conserve the carbon stock and to show evidence that the emissions do not exceed removals for the forest especially. So again, how to show that is could be somehow tricky for some countries, but these are the criteria. The third set of criteria deals with CO2, and there it's nice to explain a bit the carbon neutrality, because as strange as it could be, this kind of concept is really discussed now at European level. I don't really understand why, but because it's rather simple. In fact, if you look on the left, when growing, biomass captures CO2 from the atmosphere, and the biomass stock is growing. And sooner or later, when the wood is used for whatever purpose, the CO2 goes back to the atmosphere, creating a closed cycle. So if you can figure out that there's a kind of a closed cycle on the surface of the Earth. On the other side, just next to that, when we are using fossil fuels, we are taking carbon from the Earth's crust. In one way or another, this is converted, burnt or converted to plastics or whatever, and ends up in the atmosphere where the carbon stays for thousands of years. So there is clearly no return carbon to the soil, at least at the humankind time scale. So there is a absolutely clear difference between the biomass carbon cycle and the fossil cycles. On the right, you can see that if we are using the biomass for wood products or pulp and paper, the cycle is similarly closed also. It's just a question of the timing aspects where we can store the carbon longer if we build a wood house, for example, instead of producing energy directly. This carbon neutrality for the moment is known, is undisputed by scientists, and is recognized by the United Nations in the RES directive and in the emission trading scheme as well for the emissions of large plants. So this is not a question for the Renewable Energy Directive. What is a question for the Renewable Energy Directive is the life cycle emissions of the biomass. Because if you harvest biomass, if you transport biomass, if you produce, for example, pellets, the energy that you will use along the supply chain is not renewable. Sooner or later, this has to become renewable if we go to carbon, as we go to carbon neutrality, but for the moment, this is mainly not the case. So we can calculate the amount of CO2 along the supply chain for biomass, and we can compare these CO2 emissions with the emissions that we would have if we would continue to use fossil fuels instead of biomass. And so we can calculate a percentage of reduction. And this percentage of reduction is also regulated by the directive. The reduction needs to reach -50 to -80%, depending on the type of bioenergy and the timing as well as an importer. So this is really a significant emission reduction that is really mandatory by the directive, and that again no other renewables have, because all renewables, they have that kind of LCA emissions. Even fossil fuels have, of course, LCA emissions that we, for the moment, we don't take into account. So bioenergy is really leading the way in terms of legislation. Just some quick message to finalize this presentation. I tried to explain you that bioenergy is a key renewable energy source to reach the carbon neutrality with 60% of renewables. It definitely favors the local economy and jobs. The member states are now projecting increases for bioelectricity and bioheat. And I'm sure that Ireland will come with also very interesting numbers. I'm counting on you. With the RED II, the bioenergy is the only energy source among renewables or fossil with mandatory sustainability criteria. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jean-Marc, for your presentation. I'd like to remind attendees this morning that if you have any questions, if you could submit them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, that will allow us then to get your questions answered by our panel, which will discuss this topic at the end of the next presentation. So our next presenter is Noel Gavigan, and Noel is from the Irish Bioenergy Association and is our technical and projects executive. Noel has over 10 years experience working in the bioenergy sector for the Irish Bioenergy Association, and Noel's presentation will focus on, while Jean-Marc's focused mainly on the biomass side of the of the sectors. Noel will focus on some of the other areas briefly, and I hand over to Noel now to give his presentation. So over to you, Noel.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks very much, Jean-Marc. It was an excellent presentation, very interesting to see the European context on it, and it definitely lays out the scenario that we're looking at from a European context. I'm going to focus a little bit more on what's going on here in Ireland, or how we are fixed to meet those criteria. It's going to be fairly brief. We are obviously able to push into question time as well in this webinar, but I'll also briefly look at the other non-solid biomass materials, so that the biofuels, bioethanol, biodiesel, and anaerobic digestion as well. Just a small intro into that and how we're fitting on that. So first of all, and Sean has already given quite an introduction into IrBEA, and we also covered a wood fuel quality assurance scheme which fits into this, so I won't dwell on that, but it'll be on the slide if you want to have a look at that later on. In terms of biomass sustainability, Jean-Marc has gone into this in much greater detail, obviously from a European context. Just to look at it from an Irish context, as stated, the RED II directive sets out very detailed criteria for bioenergy. It doesn't for any other renewables, it's really for the bioenergy area. And that's very much welcomed, because most people are aware there's been worldwide debate over how sustainable everything is. We really need to look at what materials we use, when we use them, how we use them, to ensure that we're doing the right thing. It's very easy to use biomass correctly, but it's also, you know, we all use the example of, you know, taking down rainforest in Brazil is not good use of bioenergy or biomaterial at all. You know, so there is a flip side, and we have to have proper controls. And in fairness, Europe has stepped up to the mark very well on this with the RED II directive. It sets out very stringent criteria and that we all must adhere to make sure that any bioenergy that we use is kosher, is going to achieve what we look to achieve, and that is overall sustainability. Now within that, there is a number of headings, the land use criteria. Really what we're looking at there is legality is one aspect of the land use and harvest, but within the legality, and in particular here in Ireland, we have a very good felling licensing system, which governs how we manage our forests. It governs, you know, and we now have great governance over what's planted, where it's planted, and how it's managed throughout its lifespan, to ensure that we have sustainable forest management within our forestry system. So in fairness, we have a system here in Ireland that is very robust and very well recognised, which helps greatly for us in the bioenergy space. Like obviously forestry, its primary products is for lumber, is for building, but there is a lot of co-products that lend itself towards the bioenergy area. So again, as Jean-Marc laid out, the greenhouse gas criteria, we're looking at a minimum reduction of 70% by 2021, going to 80% by 2026. That's for heating and cooling and electricity. And then transport, it goes from 50% for older plant up to 65% for any new plant that's brought online. As I alluded earlier, the biodiversity protection is critically important. So that's the felling, as our whole forestry system here puts a lot of focus on forest regeneration in ensuring that we're protecting our wetlands, our peatlands, uplands, any sensitive areas like that, and ensuring that the biodiversity is well maintained. Soil is an area that has been neglected quite a bit in the past, or hasn't really been looked at, but it is critically important as a carbon sink. It's one of the largest carbon sinks that there is, and it is a huge part to play in ensuring, you know, in capture and in storage. So management of that and the LUCF, land use change, has a lot to say about how we manage our soils and how we look after them. So that's quite important. Some of this have gone into already, land use criteria for biodiversity protection, but the protection of our woodlands, peatlands, uplands, that we basically use the right species in the right place, that we manage those forests in the right way, that we protect those areas of high biodiversity. That image are just, as you can see there, it's actually a forest just outside Stradbally, and you can see a properly managed forest is a very enhanced environment. So these are the things we aspire to have in our forestry here in Ireland, and it's something that works well with the whole scenario that we're focusing on. As mentioned already, the carbon stock of soil is critically important, but we also must protect the capacity of the forest to produce. Ultimately, our forests are planted, we've two uses, and there's a debate going on at the moment as to what the actual use is, but really it's a dual use as a minimum, and one is as for a biodiverse space, and the other is for the production of lumber, the production of the lowest, and in fact, the carbon capture material. So as we move more towards timber frame construction, and which, you know, our roof space generally are timber frame, but we look towards the overall construction side and material use of wood-based material. That is all very important carbon sink material, because we're capturing carbon, and that it's very good in terms of its, you know, advantage towards our environmental protection and ensuring that we're using materials that are sustainable and biodegradable at the end of their lives. These sort of things are critically important. So we really have to protect how the production of the forest itself. The greenhouse gas reduction criteria, the RED II directive, which, as I said, is laid out by the EU, is very comprehensive document in terms of it sets out extensive tables of different feedstocks, production pathways, transport. You know, it uses all the different criteria to determine some default criteria in terms of, if you want to look up, we're going to take forest in County Carlow, we're going to produce that into wood chip and use it locally. You can look at using whole tree timber. You can look at using pulpwood, and it sets out those default criteria to look at, is it going to meet that standard of that 70% reduction in carbon emissions, or that 80% reduction in carbon emissions. And it sets out default values on that right throughout that you can use for most scenarios. And with that, you can prove that the material you're using is sustainable from a greenhouse gas production point of view. In terms of anything that falls outside of that, you can go towards a life cycle analysis assessment. There are many different tools available. That's one I have on screen. There's one that I've used quite extensively. But it's a good example of what's used. In that tool, you're using fuel supply. You start off with where is the fuel coming from. You look at the transport. You look at in this case, it was a pellet production mill, sorry, a moment. And it looks at all of the electricity use, the fuel use on that site. All of that is added into the sustainability criteria, into the carbon emissions. You're looking at that, then the transport of customer, and all of that is then included in the pathway, the life cycle analysis, to look at from the start to finish, going through that whole cycle that Jean-Marc was discussing earlier. You look at all the different range of emissions that would be associated with the production, and from that you can properly compare and determine whether you're going to meet that requirement of 80%. Now, in fairness, most wood chip, most firewood products here in Ireland, we have very good criteria. You know, we're getting 90% plus. So, and the fact that we're an island nation, one of the main criteria in the RED II directive is under 500 kilometres. You have different ranges from 500 and I think about 5,000 and then up to 25,000 kilometres. And that they obviously impact greatly on emissions. But because most of our material based in Ireland does not have huge transport distances, it might seem long to us, but from a European or a worldwide context, it's quite local. So our emissions are very low for Irish-based materials. So in fairness, bioenergy fits into our space very, very well in terms of how we approach the challenges ahead. At the moment, what we're doing for preparation here in Ireland, some of it has been led by a COFORD working group on climate change. Basically, that's a collaboration between SCI, Department of Agriculture, IrBEA, Biogas, NUIG, Quilch, and a few others I may forget to mention. And it's to look at, now it's looking at many different aspects, and not just fuel. It's looking at the sustainability of forest production. It's looking at sustainable materials, looking at mass timber construction. So we're looking at high-rise material or buildings. being built out of wood, of which we see many across the world up as far as I think 17 up to 20 stories high, with mass timber construction, not using concrete for the main structure. So you've got a huge amount of embedded carbon. So that group is doing some huge work in looking at this whole sustainability framework around forestry. So in terms of the wood fuel point of view, the biomass fuel, it's looking at how we run a certification scheme. Under RED II, we have to certify how the material to ensure that it's meeting those requirements. So one of the options is to have a national scheme, as the other is to have a voluntary certification scheme. So we within that grouping are looking at a voluntary certification scheme, and that will link into a lot of the existing things we have already, such as the felling licensing system, which provides huge information in terms of forest management. It puts a lot of control on how forests are managed and harvested. So in fairness, it's a very robust licensing system, and it's one in which we can use quite extensively. Within Ireland at the moment, we have, I suppose, 3 different ways that fuels have been certified and looked at here. We have the EN+, which covers wood pellets. We have 2 certified suppliers here on the island. With the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme, which we run in IrBEA. Within that, we have approaching 30 different suppliers around the country looking at wood fuel, such as wood chip, firewood, briquettes, and wood pellet. And within that, the WFK, we're looking at adding in, we already have sustainability criteria in there, but we're over the next number of months, we're looking to move that towards it being compliant with RED II, so that anyone that's certified through the scheme would also be certified as RED II compliant. And then finally, the BSL Biomass Suppliers list sometimes comes into play when you're dealing with Northern Ireland or material going over to the UK. But it's a good example. There's a couple of people certified through that in Ireland, but it's a good example of how a life cycle analysis is used to determine the full impact. Irish forestry material, as I said earlier on, the primary reason we're growing our forestry in terms of product out of it is lumber, is building material. The byproducts, of which are many, whether it's pulpwood, brash, sawdust, bark, and others, they can be used for materials. So pulp is often used in pulp mills for producing different forms of timber, different forms of manufactured product. But all of those materials are useful for energy. And what we are seeing, and what is the way forestry is developing, and was always going to develop, is you take out the higher value material, and if we can create a higher value from lumber, that's where the material is going to go. But ultimately, the mop up at the end is usually energy. So that's where we see things like sawdust going into wood pellets or going directly into furnaces, or the same as for brash or bark or pulp. So those materials that don't have another use are mopped up. The old soil criteria for that, or use for that, was for it to be left in the forest to rot and the CO2 to be released in that context. But this is by using it for energy, we're capturing energy within it and releasing the carbon back into the cycle from that point. The Irish wood fuels for sustainability. Really what we're looking at sourcing from sustainably managed forests. So again, the felling licensing system is excellent here in Ireland. Anything that comes in from abroad, of which there's not a lot, does have to come in through the different international certification schemes. Air drying tends to be used quite a lot here in Ireland because it's less embedded energy compared to kilns, but kilns are very useful. Transport distances, as I said, in Ireland are kept to a minimum, and the low moisture content ensures efficiency. In terms of how we control that in Ireland, I've already mentioned the felling licensing system is excellent here in Ireland. We can measure our embedded emissions through processing, harvesting, and kilns, and our transport distances here in Ireland are low by comparison. The certified fuel again ensures efficiency of appliances and reduces other emissions as well. So all of that is controlled here in Ireland. Briefly, that's where I'm just checking time there. The emissions that we have from various fuels for heating, in this case we use a domestic, the average domestic house, but the CO2 emissions across the board would also be the same for industry. So you can, in terms of using pellets, and pellets would be, the eco stove would be equivalent to using wood chip. So you can see there the amount of emissions are extremely low compared to gas, compared to kerosene. Our heat pumps at the moment in Ireland, depending on the grids, if you look at the grid at any time of the day, it'll tell you what the emissions are in kilograms of CO2, and it ranges from 200 up to as far as 560, generally in around 350 to 450 mark. And that the emissions then from a heat pump vary depending on how much or what level of emissions are coming off the grid. So you can see there the range from heat pumps. It goes from 1,000 in this case up to 1,000 to 2,800 kilograms per year for that domestic unit. So there's a range there that we take into play. So you can see there that wood fuels and bioenergy in general is far, far more efficient in terms of CO2 than any other thing out there apart from efficiency, your building envelope. So it's something that really should be embraced. Again, suitable industries for this, we're looking at food service and industry. That's more something we're going to discuss with anyone that's interested.
We'll finish up
the
on the next
biogas,
minute, Noel. Finish
no
up
problem,
in the next
John.
minute if you could, yeah.
Yeah, there's two last slides here. In terms of biogas and biomethane, this is an area where we have a lot of end uses. We can use it for transport. It's a very good option for heavy transport. There's, we can't electrify our trucks, and it is really an area where there's a lot of potential in the coming years. It is good for electricity in the fact it's dispatchable power. It can be called on 24 hours a day, regardless of the wind, regardless of solar. It's something that can be used 365 days a year, but at a little extra cost, and that's something that's been factored in. And then for heat, obviously, it can be used on site or for grid injection. The sustainability around biogas and biomethane really depends on the base material you're using. So if you're using waste materials, animal waste, food wastes, the greenhouse gas reduction parameters are excellent. We're looking at 80% reduction. Quite often with biogas coming from animal waste, you're well over 100% because of additional factors. Energy crops, there is some difficulty in meeting some of the sustainability criteria. That's something for a further day to discuss and to be worked on. Certification of biogas is complex. There is a process underway that started in 2014. It's still not available. It is something we would like to see coming on stream in the next 12 months. And finally then, just to again touch on biofuels for transport, there are three main options: bioethanol, biodiesel and biomethane. All have been used, more so bioethanol and biodiesel in Ireland, where about 5% of our transport energy is met by that. There are many things to take into account. The sourcing material usually is the biggest factor, the production cycle, so and any co-product status. There are a couple of things to look at this. Bioethanol and diesel are very suitable, obviously, for our existing transport fleet. We have to be careful with biodiesel. Excellent materials include cooking oil and tallow, some energy crops, but we have to be, what has come out of RED II directive, and it shows palm oil is something we shouldn't be using for biodiesel. It is, the production of palm oil is quite damaging, so it is something that should be avoided completely. And RED II does take that into account. Biomethane, again, as I discussed already, the process is very suitable. The feedstock is critical, and it's an excellent energy provider for heavy transport. And that's it, Sean. I'll let you take over there. You're on mute there, Sean.
Thanks very much, Noel, for your presentation. And now there's quite a few questions have come in through the Q&A. So if you have any, please feed them forward. We have 15 minutes and hopefully we'll get through. There's a number of the questions on similar areas. Just before I go through the questions with you, I just want to remind you that if there's anyone attending this morning who would like to become a member of the Irish Bioenergy Association, you can find out more on our website, and there are various levels of membership available, including individual, small, medium, or large corporate. And if you'd like to discuss this further, please contact myself. My email address is there. And indeed, just to make you aware that the fifth webinar will take place in mid-August. We're still finalising the date, but we generally stick to a Wednesday morning from 9:30 to 10:30, and all details will be published on our social media channels. And we thank you for joining us this morning, and we do hope you can join our next webinar. So we now proceed with our questions and answers. So maybe the first one for you, Jean-Marc, just more at a political level, from Philip: how does this week's EU agreement on economic recovery alter the picture for bioenergy? Or maybe you haven't had a chance to look at it as of yet, but would you have any comments regarding the EU economic recovery plan and its impacts on bioenergy, briefly?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Philip, for the question. Indeed, the council met for several days this last weekend, and they had to, as usual, they had to negotiate, really strong negotiation to reach an agreement for this 750 billion package for the recovery plan. And in fact, they had to somehow, the bad news is that they had to reduce the budget for several activities of the EU, like the Just Transition Fund. We were discussing in the last months the Just Transition Fund, so how the core regions could move to a more sustainable options, including biomass. They have cut the Horizon Europe budget, so it means less research and development, which is not good news because renewables had a significant share of it. They have reduced common agricultural policy as usual. At any opportunity they do that. Not a good news as well. And they cut the Invest EU, which is also investing in small and medium companies. So yeah, I would say that these are the negative points. Still, in the recovery plan, we could imagine as well that this money would flow, hopefully, to projects in line with the Green Deal. You know that the one major project of the EU is the Green Deal that includes these climate neutrality things. So we will argue in the coming months to establish that kind of link, that not only the COVID-19 recovery would be a criteria, but also that the money would help the companies to reach carbon neutrality. It means that that the companies, when they will have to invest and change their energy system, they will have the help of this money to come with more sustainable development. So I would say it's black and white, but a lot of fresh money like this could be beneficial.
Thanks, Jean-Marc. There's a couple of questions here about the potential for the bioeconomy, meaning the production of chemicals from pulp, added value, valorization of biomass. Noel, can you just briefly explain maybe your thoughts on this, and also maybe explain again the different elements that would be conducive to bioenergy, and maybe how the bioeconomy is going to develop, maybe providing more markets for this type of material, and indeed as we move forward. So can you just maybe highlight what your thoughts are on the whole bioeconomy area and the increase?
Yes, look, we've been neglecting what we can take out of our biomass material over the last number of decades. I mean, we've extensively determined what we can take out of oil, you know, all the different plastics and different products. But really and truly going towards biorefining and what we can establish and extract, we're only starting on that journey. And there's a huge range of products already available and useful, everything from insulation products to plastic types to you know, the range is extensive. So you know that's a whole other conversation. But there is huge potential to gather higher value products from our base materials before we ever look at energy. And as I said before, energy is a mop-up product. You know, when you can no longer extract something of value out of it, then energy can use the remainder.
Okay, thanks, Noel. Just to, there's a few people here have asked just about the slides being circulated after the webinar, and just to let you all know that the slides will be available in the coming days, if not this week, early next week. But there will be circulated a link, and also this is being recorded, so it will be available on our website for anyone to view or to review again. Just a couple of questions here then about biomethane, and I know the focus of this morning has been more on the biomass sector, challenges of AD and biomethane in Ireland, and also the potential of seaweed, algae and Irish Bioenergy. But just to let you all know that there will be a specific focus on biomethane and biogas in the next number of webinars coming up. So we're not going to maybe dwell on that this morning because we have quite a few questions to get through in the remaining time. But just to let you know that there will be a focus on that in the next couple of webinars, and we will come back to maybe some of the questions that have been put here or put forward here. Just a quick one there, Noel, maybe for you from Justin. Please talk about the implementation measures which will allow RED II to be up and running in Ireland, downstream of forestry licenses, sawmills, and how many, and maybe then just over to Jean-Marc after then, how have other EU countries approached this from a governance, oversight, regulatory perspective? So Noel, first of all, quickly, if I could ask you to keep your answers as brief as possible to get through as many questions as we can. Thank you.
Yeah, it's something we are working on at this moment in time to get RED II compliance up and running in the country. It's a long conversation in terms of what is required, but we are confident there's a lot of potential in that. It's all about management of the feedstocks and where it's coming from, and having good control over the mass balances. So it is something that is coming down the line and has to be in place by the start of next year. So I don't see any major issue in us getting to that, but it's quite difficult to outline it very quickly. Look, I've pointed out, and I just noticed, Sean, if you don't mind, a couple of questions coming in about the felling licensing system. And
we'll come to them in a second, Noel, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
If you just go to Jean-Marc, maybe on that question, the last question about at a European level, what's been done in terms of the RED II sustainability compliance?
What is going on? For the moment, as I mentioned, the directive has been approved. So the directive is not discussed anymore, but we are discussing the implementation of it because the criteria are entering into force on the 1st of July 2021. So if the companies cannot provide evidence that the biomass they are using is sustainable, then the electricity or heat they will produce will not be sustainable. It means will not count for the target, will not be eligible for any kind of public support. So and this is in 1 year from now. And we, for the moment, the criteria of the Commission are still unclear. So the Commission is working with consultants to define these criteria, and there is an ongoing consultation, by the way, with this consultant in a project called RED II Bio. Then this consultation is deadline is on the 24th of July, so this Friday. So we will, together with our members, we are collecting now the contribution for this consultation. So it's really a short-term deadline, but and after that, yeah, the methodology for the implementation should be available by somewhere by the end of this year, helping the member states to come with schemes and also international independent voluntary schemes. We also help the companies to be compliant with this criteria.
Okay, thanks, Jean-Marc. Just going back to you, Noel. I know there's a number of queries here about the felling license system, and correctly alluding to the fact that there's issues from an administrative perspective. I think you're referring to the system in itself in terms of what it does, rather than the actual administration of the system. But could you just explain and answer some of the queries here from Nicholas, from Paul, on the whole felling license system. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's look, there is huge difficulties there in its implementation at the moment. They've had a huge level of objections to a number of applications, and there's a huge backlog, which is causing huge problems within the industry at the moment. Where I'm commenting on is purely in terms of meeting the sustainability criteria. It is an excellent tool for doing that. It covers everything very, very well. But there is an administrative issue there at the moment that Department of Agriculture are trying to work through, and it has caused significant difficulty within the industry over the last 6 months and longer, but in particular over the last 6 months.
And I know there's a question here, what can be done to make the system work? And I think we could have a whole webinar on that if at a future date. And it's probably something we just don't have the time to go into this morning, but we can revisit that at a future webinar. And so it's a question from a follow-up question from Nicholas. Just one there from Porrick, just deer and planting broadleaf trees. Can we expect any improvement in funding for deer fencing as part of afforestation schemes? I think there is regular review of the forestation program. I think the next review is due quite shortly, and it is something certainly which could be proposed, and to see could that be included. Question here again back to forestry in terms of missing afforestation targets. It is a big issue, and I think that also could be addressed in the context of the review of the forestry program. Go back to Jean-Marc, or maybe actually Noel as well. From Philip, would introducing a woodland carbon code and voluntary carbon market in Ireland help or hinder increase in bioenergy production here? So that's a question from Philip. Noel, I'll ask you to take that one.
Sorry, just explain that again. I missed that.
Would introducing a woodland carbon code and voluntary carbon market in Ireland help or hinder increased in bioenergy production here? That's the specific question.
Yeah, it's possibly could. I mean, it all depends on what it's underpinned on. In terms of where the carbon price is going to be underpinned and who's underpinning it. So that's really the question in a lot of these areas. But look, the whole carbon market and how we value it within our forestry stock over the next number of years is really going to be the main topics of conversation. I understand at the moment a lot of that is covered under national figures, so that might preclude individuals from doing so, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay, thanks. Jean-Marc, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, because we have always argued in the last years that we need kind of more sustainable system to improve the competitiveness of renewables. And this, in our opinion, goes with the carbon pricing as well, whatever the form of it. But we need a kind of more polluter pay principle compared to the current subsidy system that when renewables are taking a larger share of the market, the member states, especially for the time being, cannot afford anymore. So while with the carbon pricing, it improves the budget of the member states. So I think this is a kind of natural way that the member states will understand and hopefully convince the citizens that that this is the way forward as well. But yes, carbon pricing is the way forward for bioenergy development.
Okay, we're coming close to the end. There's still just a couple of outstanding and final questions. Just one here from Colin, and I won't ask the panel to answer it, but it's regard to the SRH and what is happening with applications and have updated application documents been approved. So just Colin, to let you know, we're working closely with the SEI on, we do understand there are issues associated with the implementation of the SRH. We're working very closely with our members and with the SEI on that. And I can, if I can get in touch with you later, if you can give me a call, we can discuss it further. Another question here, which I'll throw over to you, Jean-Marc, and then final one for Noel. Do you foresee the opportunities for refined tallow oils or others, including turpentine, to be widely used in the bioenergy sector in Ireland? it's probably quite specific, but and maybe it might be better for Noel to answer that one. Just Noel on that one, if you can quickly come in. Or Jean-Marc.
Or maybe Jean-Marc might have some answers on it. Again, it goes into my comments on the whole wider bioeconomy on it.
For this, I think that the pulp and paper industry is really a kind of key position now in the industry, because they have a supply chain established already for biomass. And in Europe, the pulp and paper industry is quite dynamic. So they really diversify their products because they have a lot of byproducts in their process as well. And I'm really, in Bioenergy Europe, we are also in favor of the bio-based economy, because we think that there are synergies with the energy sector. And the more we go for the bio-based energy economy, we will have more opportunities as well for bioenergy to use the byproducts. The low-value byproducts will end up in the energy sector. So yes, for sure, the pulp and paper industry is already at the moment representing the lion's share of the industrial applications for bioenergy, and this will continue in the future, for sure.
Okay, Noel, just a comment or a question from an anonymous attendee. Does this and the tool you were talking about in terms of the analysis take account of the boatloads of pulp heading from here to the UK or Great Britain every week? So if you just want to comment on that.
Yeah. If the pulp, and I suppose not to comment on any particular economic or commercial thing going on at the moment, but in general, if the material is going in for wouse as a fuel in an EU country, and there's obviously a few caveats around that when it's going to the UK, then it would need to show RED II compliance. That'd be the underlying part of that. You know, and the whole sustainability criteria will kick in if it's looking for RED II compliance. Okay,
thanks, Noel. And just Kieran here to comment about the potential for seaweed algae and Irish bioenergy. I suppose we have an abundance, just to answer that one, we have an abundance of feedstock available, but it's about assessing economically how that could be harvested, what the costs of processing are, and so it would have to be assessed in that context, and also from a sustainability perspective, but certainly presents opportunities, but it remains to be seen, and it would have to be assessed as to whether it would be economically viable or not. And just a final kind of question again from Kieran, maybe two questions we can link together, and these I'll ask both of you this to conclude, because we're just going over the time. From Kieran again, how do you consider the effects of land use change and indirect land use change for Irish bioenergy, and maybe comment on areas of utilization from forestry residues? What are the most underutilized areas for bioenergy from forestry residues? So just in conclusion, if you could maybe comment on those two final questions, and we will close it up then. So Noel first, and then I'll give the concluding remarks to Jean-Marc.
Sorry, John, there was just a bit of a signal issue there. Say that again.
So if you could comment on the land use change from a bioenergy perspective, and then what are the most underutilized areas for bioenergy from forestry residues? So maybe comment on the use of forestry residues, and explain how that fits within the overall forestry output in terms of energy.
You know, the byproducts and those underutilized parts. I mean, brash is probably the prime example, where we've not really been harvesting brash. It hasn't been included in those figures yet. It's as much as, you know, it's quite a high percentage of the production of the forest. This brash being the side branches, the top branches that are often left to rot in the forest. That has been used very successfully, and is used very successfully as a fuel here in Ireland. There is a little bit of management issues and how you deal with it, but it does leave the forest a lot easier to deal with. You no longer have large bundles of brash and reeks of brash to deal with, for replanting purposes and for normal management purposes. So there's huge potential, and it helps forest management no end to harvest that sort of material. And if done correctly, you're retaining the nutrients by allowing the needles to drop off. Like you harvest brash, leave it to sit for 6 months, and so that the needles can come off. And if done correctly, then you're returning all the nutrients to the ground. So that's a critical thing. The land use change, I mean, we've a lot of discussions being had on those already, but really and truly we have to look at how we're managing that land stock. The protection of the soils is critical. So the management, therefore, of how we manage our forests, how we manage our land use to protect those soils and protect the carbon stock in the soil is critical. And any changes we make, again, we need to ensure we do it to protect our wetlands, our peatlands, our uplands. So it's done in a manner that is not going to affect them in a detrimental way. And RED II is very strong on ensuring that, and ensuring that we're maintaining biodiversity. So, you know, a lot of this is being addressed and is being covered under RED II, and I have to say it's quite extensive in that format.
Okay, Jean-Marc, just the concluding remarks from yourself, and if you could comment on those two specific issues, one about land use change and the other about the forestry residues, and we will then conclude.
Yeah, thanks. In terms of biomass potential, of course, you need a local approach to establish what kind of residues is available. What we did at the European level is to commission a study that showed that we can increase the amount of bioenergy by 2.5. It means going from 140 million ton equivalent today to something like 400 million ton equivalent in 2030 and 50, it depends. While keeping the sustainability criteria okay. It means that there is still at the European level room for growth. This should be done sustainably, of course, but we are of the opinion as an association that we should not make the criteria of the directive more stringent at this stage. And this is a progressive approach. We have agreed, we had a very long negotiation among the member states to reach these criteria. Now we have to implement what we have, but there are many voices saying that we need to go beyond this. But you know, and the sky is the limit. If you want to really increase the criteria, it's possible in theory. But really, we have to. It's already a challenge to implement the comprehensive criteria that we have now. So we have our homework now before revising these criteria, and indirect land use change is taken into account for biofuels.
Okay, thanks very much, Jean-Marc, and thanks to you for your participation this morning. Thanks to Noel. I'd like to also acknowledge and thank Teresa O'Brien, who behind the scenes organises all of this for us in the Bioenergy Association. I'd like to thank all of you, the participants this morning. I'd like to acknowledge and to say that thank you for your questions. We've endeavoured to answer them as comprehensively as possible, but obviously that's not always possible on a webinar like this. So if you have any specific questions, feel free to forward them to my email address, seanfinan@irbea.org, and I will endeavour to get an answer for you. And that really concludes our webinar this morning, and we look forward to seeing you on the next occasion. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you.